So a huge warm welcome to all of you. I'm Jennifer Davidson. I'm a professor and executive director at something called the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. And on behalf of both the Inspiring Children's Futures team and the university's new Centre for Sustainable Development, I'd like to say how absolutely delighted we are to have you be a part of our webinar today. And so I'm sending an enthusiastic welcome from Scotland to Hong Kong, to Abu Dhabi, to Montreal today, and from South Africa to Sweden. You are all very much very welcome. In the next, through the course of the next 90 minutes, we are going to be hearing a short welcome that is more formal from our Professor Ian Rivers. And then we're going to hear a brief overview from me about inspiring children's futures. And then at the heart of this webinar, we'll be hearing from three absolutely brilliant, insightful, and child-centered speakers, each of whom bring a very different perspective on how we can achieve our global goals and ambitions for children. So I'm really hopeful that you will find their different perspective inspiring and inspires new thinking and, as always, new actions. So there'll be time for discussion at the end, and we'd be delighted if you would consider contributing your questions or comments through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And now I would love to invite Professor Ian Rivers. He is our Associate Principal at the University of Strathclyde and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, inviting you to offer your formal university welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, my name is Ian Rivers and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the University of Strathclyde. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar, which is the last in a series we've been holding over the past week or so, and it follows the successful launch of the university's new Centre for Sustainable Development. And on that note, I would especially welcome those joining us from right across the world. This is going to be truly an international seminar. The launch of the Centre for Sustainable Development is a momentous step for our university. And you may have heard our Principal and Vice Chancellor, Sir Jim MacDonald, at the main launch event last week, describe this as a critical step forward for the university in terms of our pursuit of our globally socially progressive vision. We at Strathclyde see sustainable development as an imperative in every domain of every society, embracing not only high-profile environmental and climate sustainability that has now rightly been recognized as a matter of global urgency, but also, and most importantly, in the enhancement of all of our societies and cultures more broadly. As reflected in the vision of the United Nations Agenda for 2030 and our worldwide sustainable development goals, we see those goals as being crucial to all of our communities across the globe. Our Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures is the first and perhaps most important example of our ambition to contribute to the massive global challenges to enhance social sustainability and specifically to ensure the well-being of future generations throughout the world. As we will no doubt hear more of later, the Institute is already engaging with the front line, working with those delivering children's services throughout the world, with policy and decision makers in government and international organizations, and with international NGOs. But importantly, it is increasingly this work that is being underpinned by sustainable and serious scholarship. Our knowledge and knowledge sharing cannot, I beg your pardon, and never should stand still. And our institute developing research capacity is crucial to the generation of evidence-based and experience-based innovative thinking, which we can apply to real-world situations. So I hope that you will enjoy today, and it's my pleasure to hand back to the Executive Director of the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures, Professor Jennifer Davidson, who was on Friday, and she's going to blush now, honoured by the Queen with an OBE. I hope that you have a sustaining and fruitful webinar, and I look forward to listening to everyone's contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Let's continue on then with some slides. And next is a bit of an overview for me. So what I'd like to do is share with you a bit of a context. First of all, because I know that we're coming from a lot of different perspectives today, I'm briefly going to touch on the SDGs. I'm going to briefly touch on the gap that between our ambitions and what children are experiencing, and then tell you just a little bit about inspiring children's futures, and then we get to the heart of the presentation. So SDGs. I think many of us might be familiar with this, so forgive me, but for those of you who may not be so familiar with this, there is a plan that has been agreed by all member countries of the United Nations that is the importance of focusing our minds on 17 global goals that we're trying to achieve by 2030. And what I'd like to point out about these goals are three really important differences between these sustainable development goals and what were the Millennium Development Goals previously. And they differ in terms of how they apply to us in three ways. The first is that these SDGs apply to all countries. This is not an agenda just for lower income countries. So we are as responsible in the UK to be responding and fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals as we might be in any other country. These goals, the second thing is these goals pledge not to just improve, if you will, the sort of average or improve the distribution curve, if you will, but it's actually calling us to leave no one behind. And within it then is an imperative to consider those who are most marginalized and those who are facing the greatest adversities. And thirdly, these goals explicitly name children for the first time. And so there is much to be celebrating in terms of understanding then how can we use the Sustainable Development Goals in our agenda that we have been working for across for many of us, our careers, to be trying to change the world and make it a better place for children. SDG 16, if I can draw your attention to that one, is of particular importance. And it is for inspiring children's futures as much as it might be for many others. And that is because in collaboration with a whole range of fantastic partners, including those who are represented on the panel, we were commissioned by the International UN member state-led Pathfinders for Peace, Just and Inclusive Societies. And together we developed a call to action and a challenge paper that called for what were the priorities for us around the world to tackle injustices that are faced by children around the world. And this Justice for Children, Justice for All call to action asserts that we need to be responding to children's distinct needs and realizing their full range of rights and opportunities if we're really going to be able to achieve what we call for in SDG 16, which is peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So it's really bringing children to the heart of what we're trying to achieve in SDG 16. But now let's talk about the gap. There is really, unfortunately, a stark gap between this ambition that we have to counter injustice and the reality that many children face in all countries. And really, despite some great work over many years, it's self-evident that we're not yet succeeding, that many children still face lives and experience things in their lives that fall far, far short from the quality that they have a right to in their lives. And so we still, of course, still have much to do. And while we might know a lot about children and what we know and how we apply that knowledge, we still haven't clearly been able to do enough to consistently secure the political and the economic priorities that are needed to actually sustain the interventions that will help us to fulfill this global ambition for children. And we knew all this before COVID. And COVID then compounds this gap. This gap becomes much more concerning at what feels like a really critical moment in our history in light of COVID, where the rights and the well-being of children and their families have abruptly encountered a much greater risk around the world. And in the context of very dire financial predictions over the future many years post-COVID, it then makes the imperative that much stronger to find ways to accelerate our progress really dramatically, to add real momentum and coherence to our activities, and to more effectively implement to deliver these commitments. And we know that closing this gap and minimizing the impact on COVID on children is absolutely critical to realizing children's rights and well-being. We also know that it's critical if we want to see long-term societal and global recovery. And so Inspiring Children's Futures is focusing its work on contributing a number of key things to achieve to address these increasing challenges. Here we go. And now, as Dean Professor Rivers has said, I'm the Executive Director of Inspiring Children's Futures. I'm also the founding director almost a decade ago of the Center for Children's Care and Protection, which some of you may know already very well, called CELSIS. CELSIS is a key partner in the work of Justice for Children. We're a leading improvement and innovation centre, an independent body based at Strathclyde with a primary focus on Scotland and on enhancing the well-being of children in care or at risk and in need of protection. And additionally, we have for many years at CELSIS also contributed to the work of agencies internationally, particularly in helping to support the implementation of the UN's global guidance on alternative care for children. So Inspiring Children's Futures was formed 3 years ago and has an explicitly global focus, working to promote children's needs, rights, and opportunities across both the high and low income countries to deliver this Justice for Children challenge. My ambition has always been to not only take what we've learned from Scotland and to share it supportively and modestly across the world, but also to access the vast understanding and the insights that have been developed around the world about caring for children. And we want to proactively and energetically use these to help all nations to design better approaches to what are huge challenges. So you will have guessed already that in this work, we're guided and motivated by the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why we're so delighted to be a part of the Centre for Sustainable Development that we celebrate at Strathclyde. But we're also guided and motivated absolutely by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I see these as essential drivers to realizing children's rights and ultimately to ensuring children's agency and their well-being. And our work aims to engage with and benefit the full breadth of those with experience and expertise in this area that I've been describing. So practitioners, those who are delivering services, academics who are striving to find new and innovative ways to address the big challenges we all face, right through to, and very significantly, policymakers who seek to design and implement the best policy available. That is, senior leaders at all levels of government, government ministers, and leaders of the international NGO community. And what's, I think, a distinguishing feature of Justice for Children and of the work of Inspiring Children's Futures has been our aim to engage with those across government and civil society who might not actually see themselves as having anything to do with children, actually. But who in fact have a critical contribution to make that we must capture. My colleagues have often heard me refer to these as the unusual suspects. And I believe that we're not going to succeed to close the gap that is being made even greater by COVID if we are not engaging with and winning the interest and contributions of these key people. And so Inspiring Children's Futures draws on a core of experts in child well-being, and especially children in adversity and the most left behind. But we also draw on some of these more unusual suspects. We have a vision that children have what they need to reach their full potential, particularly those who face adversity. And we are aiming to do 3 things. We wish to increase the available evidence. We want to inform better policies and practices. And we want to help authorities to find ways to make the changes that need to be made to better respond to children. And we do this in a few different ways that I'd like to flag, not least because last week we launched 2 of these things. So one is an effort to understand better what's happening with children and young people around the world through the eyes of practitioners and policymakers. We are wanting to understand better how they are seeing the services and the access to various services for children around the world. And if you haven't downloaded this app, you are one of these policymakers or practitioners with some concern for children's well-being, please do so. These are the number of countries. We have 29 countries and 5 continents in which this app is now being downloaded. And we watch as the numbers are going up by the hour as people are downloading this for free in the App Store and the Google Play Store. And the key partners that we are engaging with here across the world have been fantastic in helping us to shape what does this app need to look like and what are the questions we need to be asking practitioners on a daily basis to really get a good sense of what's happening across children's rights and their well-being. But in addition to this, so that's the app. That was my promotional message for the app. I needed to get in there, but I also would like to tell you that just last week we contributed we launched a Center for Doctoral Training, and so we have 5 studentships that are fully funded for 5 of the best PhD candidates we can possibly find who would like to come and work with us on this vision and on delivering a better future for children in the context of COVID and in supporting post-COVID recovery. I think a great example of how we're trying to better policies and practices are embedded in some of the examples I've shared with you already with the Justice for Children project. And we continue to work closely with the Pathfinders for Justice, Peace and Inclusive Societies, and we're delighted to continue to be doing so. We're also working with the OECD that you may be hearing in a few moments from Romina as we talk about the challenges that the OECD is looking to take up and tackle in partnership with others, and we're delighted to be working with them on all of this. So that's your whistle-stop tour of what is the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures. You'll see just from the images on the screen how important partnership is in our work, because of course we're here to prompt and help and support, but it's everyone coming together that will actually make things happen. And in my speaking, I think I'm hopeful that you're not only hearing about the importance of partnership, but also about the importance of bringing together very many different perspectives. And that's what our webinar is about today, is trying to bring in perspectives from international law, from national legal systems, from the economic context, and from children's real lives and their experiences, and sometimes the unintended consequences for children of policies that might have the best intentions, but land particularly poorly for children. And we have 3 phenomenal speakers today, as I've said earlier, and the first of our speakers is Professor Anne Skelton. The next will be Romina Borini, and then the third will be Manaf Kimokai. And then we'll have a chance for discussion and questions and answers. So let me give a little plug to the Q&A at the moment in case there's anything you'd like to say about this. And if you'd like any of the links to the app or to the Center for Doctoral Training, please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll see if we can get those links into the presentation as well for you. So without further ado, let me say that, let me just tell you a little bit about Anne Skelton. Now, for many of us, if not most of us, Anne does not need any introductions, but I will give you one anyway, just in case you are someone who is one of our perhaps less usual suspects. So Anne is an elected member of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. She's also, I am delighted to say, a visiting professor here at the University of Strathclyde with the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures. She is a professor of law at the University of Pretoria. She holds the UNESCO Chair in Education Law in Africa. Until recently, she was the director of the Center for Child Law. Anne is a deeply respected global figure in academia and across international children's rights practice, with an established track record in the areas of youth justice and alternative care in both research and legal practices. Notably, Anne has worked as a children's rights lawyer in South Africa for over 25 years and has effectively lobbied for the rights of children in the criminal justice system throughout her career. She chaired the South African Law Reform Committee that drafted the Child Justice Act and led the UN Technical Assistance Project to prepare for its implementation. And I could go on, but I will not, because I know it's Anne you'd like to hear from. And so I'd like to hand over to Anne to speak to us today. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for those kind words, and congratulations to you on your award. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Dean Rivers, as well, for your words of introduction, and hello to everyone from Pretoria. The Committee on the Rights of the Child mainstreams the Sustainable Development Goals into its work. And you will notice that very often in concluding observations, you will see that the committee does pick up on where states are falling behind in what they have promised in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, recently, obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the committee has been turning its attention to what some of the impacts of that will be on delays in the fulfillment of children's rights, including under the SDGs. And early on in the pandemic, the committee issued a statement warning about the grave effects of short-term and long-term impacts that were being caused by the pandemic. And just to pick out a few of the issues that were relevant to SDGs, education was up front and central, with the committee pointing out that measures being taken, for example, to move to technological methods of education, would have to be careful not to entrench existing inequalities, which of course is there are two SDGs linked together. Also, the importance of nutrition and the fact that food is often delivered through school feeding schemes was one of the issues that was flagged by the committee. Healthcare, not only just healthcare linked to COVID, but obviously all the other healthcare services that would normally be going on, many of which were halted or badly affected by the pandemic, concerns around the stopping of vaccinations and birth registration, which is so important because many services link to it. Child protection and the importance of protection from violence was also flagged by the committee, and the committee urging states not to, allow any setbacks in the field of child protection, and indeed to step up and to provide greater support and protection during these difficult times. Children who are living in vulnerable situations were singled out, in particular children deprived of their liberty in any settings, where the committee was calling on states to make sure that these children were released where possible, and if that wasn't possible, that they were to be protected and to maintain contact with their families. So these were just some of the things that the committee put out there, and that was quite early on. This was around early April when that statement went out. Now, subsequently, the committee has also started to think more long-term about this, and recently in lists of issues prior to reporting, or lists of issues that have been sent out to states parties in recent months. As you may know, the committee has been continuing to do its work online because our face-to-face sessions have been unable to take place. But we've been continuing to send out lists of issues, and we are now asking questions such as, what measures are states taking to ensure the protection of children's rights in the context of COVID-19 and to mitigate the adverse effects of that going forward? So obviously the committee is going to have to start asking questions around budget reprioritization and austerity measures following COVID, and ask states to ensure that this doesn't set us back even further. In this regard, it's important to note General Comment number 19 on budgeting for children's rights, which stated at paragraph 31 that states parties should not allow the existing level of enjoyment of children's rights to deteriorate. In times of economic crisis, regressive measures may only be considered after assessing all other options and ensuring that children are the last to be affected, especially children in vulnerable situations. States parties shall demonstrate that such measures are necessary, reasonable, proportionate, non-discriminatory, and temporary, and that any rights thus affected will be restored as soon as possible. The immediate and minimum core obligations imposed by children's rights shall not be compromised by any retrogressive measures, even in times of economic crisis. And this general comment was written in 2016, before we knew of any pandemic that was coming, but obviously it's particularly important now, given the situation that we're all facing. Now, access to justice, particularly if it's understood as access to social justice, is so important as a driver for the SDGs. And here I'd like to take off my international hat, if I may, and tell you a story about something that has happened in South Africa during the pandemic. In South Africa, 9 million children normally receive a daily meal at school. And this may, for many children, be the most nutritious meal that they have. And in fact, for many, it might be the only proper meal that they have each day. So because schools were closed during lockdown, school feeding stopped. Then some grades came back to school, but the Department of Education didn't restart the school feeding scheme. An organization called Equal Education went to court to demand the Department of Education reinstate school feeding. And the evidence for the case was gathered by school children who are linked to this organization, Equal Education. And they gathered information which they put up in sworn statements for the court, describing the dire situation of poverty that many children were experiencing, and many children were experiencing serious hunger and going to bed hungry. This evidence was placed before the court, and the Centre for Child Law entered as a friend of the court and brought the international law arguments, including that general comment number 19 that I've just read from earlier, and also spoke about state party reports to the CRC and the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committees. The case was heard online, and the Council for Equal Education started off his address by asking the judge whether the court case could be live streamed, because the school children who'd been gathering the evidence wanted to follow the proceedings in the virtual courtroom. The judge allowed it, and the children did participate by listening then, and have subsequently also been involved in monitoring what happened after the case. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that the case was won, and the Minister of Education was ordered to start school feeding immediately. And as I say, children have been continuing to monitor how things are going at their schools. Now, I think that this case is a tangible demonstration of how important SDG 16, access to justice, is for ensuring that all of the SDGs might be realized. But in order to see more of that happening, we're going to have to ensure capacity building at the domestic level. So we need to see more partnerships, more strong working together to try to hold governments accountable on the promises that they've made under the SDGs. Now, in this regard, I want to just say that I think it's a great positive development that I see Scotland has introduced a bill to incorporate the CRC, and this is a great step forward. And it will make many aspects of the CRC directly implementable in Scotland. However, it's perhaps also important to note that because the bill, as I understand it, doesn't include other instruments like general comments, even as interpretive principles, I'm not suggesting that they're binding, but they are interpretive, that would mean that general comment 19 that I read out earlier, for example, wouldn't be captured in there. So there is perhaps still some room for lobbyists to try to see how far one might be able to push that. So I think these are the kinds of concerted actions that we need to take forward under SDG 16 and SDG 17, which is partnerships, to make sure that every other one of the SDGs, particularly those relevant for children, are made real. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was great. And I know it's always a bit odd because you're just talking to your camera and you've got no sort of response around you, but that was, you had people absolutely taking notes. I know it. And there's we put in the chat box for attendees the general comment 19, and I think you raise a number of really interesting points and really important challenges. And it strikes me just how challenging that is to member states. And I want to turn our attention now to what does it feel like being a member state and having a budget to balance and making a whole range of different decisions with these international, international legal requirements to fulfill in the context of the tensions of many other requirements having to address these as well. And I think that's the perspective we'll be hearing now from Romina. And so let me introduce you to Dr. Romina Borini. So I've got a long, really fantastic list of things to tell you about Romina. I think Romina you'll be less known to our world of sort of children's agencies and children's, but ought to be, and I would like to tell them why. So Romina is the acting director of a new center that's been established in the OECD called the WISE Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity. And here she promotes the OECD's position as a leading international institution in these areas of well-being, of inclusion, of equalities and sustainability, and to contribute to strengthening the OECD's research and evidence on the beyond GDP agenda, so policies for well-being, for inclusive growth, for the SDGs. Romina was previously a senior advisor to the OECD Secretary General and the head of the Inclusive Growth Initiative, which will be of real interest to us here in Scotland for those of us who are listening with that hat on. Romina has also been the deputy head of the Wellbeing Division in the Statistics Directory within the OECD and the head of the Wellbeing and Progress section. And perhaps particularly of interest to us today, Dr. Borini was also a postdoctoral fellow in sustainable development at the Chaire EDF École Polytechnique and worked as a consultant to the French Ministry of Social Affairs long before that. So a long, really interesting history of your work. And I know that, Romina, you've been spearheading really this agenda for children's well-being across the OECD, and we're really excited to hear from you about what that means and what we can learn from you. So over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon all. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and well, I shall start by thanking Children Inspiring Futures and the new Center for Sustainable Development to bring us together, all of us together around the well-being questions, and in particular the child well-being question. With Jennifer and Andrew, we have been now partnering for a couple of years, and in fact, we are stepping up our cooperation on how we can best enhance the child well-being, and especially in this particular circumstances. And I think the previous speaker highlighted already very well how critical is the situation right now. But we're doing a lot of work with Jennifer and Andrew, and in fact I hope that today's conversation will also feed into another conversation we are having tomorrow with our member countries, so the OECD countries, where we're having a discussion on how we can best secure the recovery, the ambition and resilience of the well-being of children in the post-COVID-19 decade. And the idea behind the work we're doing on that is really we want to engage very early on with the members, because indeed we think that this is going to be of a primary importance to all of them to ensure that they have the right tools and strategy and thinking in place for promoting the rights, the needs and the opportunities for children. Jennifer and Anne have already stressed how important are SDGs, and in particular, well, SDG 16, but in fact, as some have said already, many of the other SDGs are obviously very relevant from the perspective of enhancing child well-being. Let me just quote a study that we did at the OECD, I think we published it last year, And that study, we're looking at how OECD countries are actually faring with respect to SDGs, and in particular in the area that concerned the well-being of children. And what was quite remarkable, but not necessarily in terms of good news, is the fact that even in OECD countries, of course, are the richest countries of the world, we are very, very far from achieving a number of SDGs. And so if you take a look, for instance, at goal number 4, which is around education and quality of education, but also the goal number 1, which is around poverty, 2, which is around food and food protection and food security, and of course the goal on decent work and inclusive growth, number 8, and goal number 16, which is about peace and access to justice. So there you see that really a lot still needs to be accomplished by OECD countries, to actually get to reach the targets on child well-being that indeed they have sort of signed up to in 2016. And that was before the pandemic. So I think that only is suggestive of, again, all the challenges that countries may face in this respect. But another very interesting insight from that study was that, again, even in the best economists of the world that have the most advanced statistical infrastructures, we still are, in fact, lacking some basic data, especially when it comes to vulnerable children. So especially when you're looking at children really left behind. And so, for instance, if you take a very basic example, which is the issue of prevalence of child maltreatment, I know the OECD started looking into this probably 10 years ago. Not so much progress has been done, unfortunately. And again, we really feel this is an area where countries should do more work, especially, with the idea that it's not just about producing better data, in each of the countries, but also coming up with standardized and harmonized data at international level. So we're glad, in fact, that UNICE has set up a task force on statistics on children, adolescents, and youth. And we are contributing to that task force because that task force is exactly mandated, to fill some of those gaps in a way that can best support the achievement of SDGs. Now, as I said already, we are stepping up efforts in the OECD because we do recognize very strongly that higher level of investment is needed, but also better policy making to manage the impact of the COVID-19 of children. We published just before the summer a short brief called Combating the Effect of COVID-19 on Children. And I think if I had to summarize, in a sentence, the results of that brief, essentially, the results were as follows. First of all, the number of vulnerable children has increased, but also the needs of the vulnerable have increased. And so we know, of course, that COVID has exposed and highlighted inequalities. And I think Anne was talking about, the impacts of going digital, that school going digital and what that means, in fact, obviously, for all those households and families that are not that either don't have any access to distance technology, digital technology, or even if they have access, they are not digitally literate. But we have documented other facts that were just suggestive of again the deterioration of the well-being of the most vulnerable children and households. In fact, we have some quite, I would say, powerful statistics that tells us that the number of vulnerable families that the OECD defines, such as the families that don't have 3 months of income in terms of savings and assets. And so it means those essentially those households just go poor, become poor if they forego 3 months of income. So that number was actually already quite high. It was 30% before the pandemic hit, and is now larger, and in fact is the largest among the families with children. So we have already ample evidence. Another area is mental health. There again, we have evidence emerging from some of our countries telling us that especially the most vulnerable children have been impacted by that. So we already have quite a lot of evidence, but of course we know that we should produce even more. And this is part of what we're going to do in the future with Jennifer and Andrew. So one of the very, very important projects for us right now, but I'm going to go there in a minute, is really to look at the issues of how can we make sure that the well-being of children is prioritized, in a context where there are a lot of pressures, including fiscal pressures coming obviously from the crisis. Before I say a little bit more about what our next intended steps on that work, maybe I should give you some introductions around the work that the OECD has done on child well-being, because indeed Jennifer said that you know, to some extent we are coming sort of new to this topic, but on the other hand, we've been working a bit on that over the last 10 years. Very much, I would say, from an economic perspective, but it is one I think that is really complementary to you know, to the other ones that have been discussed and are going to be discussed in the seminar today. So it joins, I think, the line on making sure that, you know, we are all sort of collectively joining forces and working together to produce evidence that supports the ambition of fulfilling the SDGs for children. We are in a way in a unique position, I think, to convince and inform you know, policies and governments that they should do something for improving the well-being of children. What the OECD does, I mean, for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, is we produce a lot of data and evidence and policy analysis, but at the end of the day, the idea is really to bring together the governments and to share, of course, the good practices in terms of what governments are already doing, but also the challenges that they are experiencing. And at the same time, we are engaging not just with our members and let's say, and their sort of respective domestic policies, but we are also engaging with a number of multilateral organizations that, in fact, are looking you know, into the issue of SDGs. And so this is perhaps an area where we could also, you know, work together, you know, a little bit more in the future, but we are supporting the G7 and G20 presidencies. And so, you know, some of the streams that we are currently, you know, discussing with the institute that Jennifer is directing could well fit into that. The interesting, I think, other feature of our work at OECD is that, you know, we are looking at this in a very horizontal and holistic manner. So, you know, we're not just saying child well-being is an issue within education or within schools, but we are really, you know, approaching it from a whole of the government perspective, because the way we are essentially engaging with our experts in the organization, but also, you know, with the committees and the representatives of member countries, is really one that help, you know, countries connect the value of children's well-being to different areas of the government. So, you know, we have child well-being experts in the areas of work that relate to digital policy, to social policy, to early child cognitive development, and etc. So, and measurement, of course. So we have all of that. And one of the perhaps emphasis that I want to stress this afternoon, and one of the sort of specific focuses in this idea of building evidence on the cost of deprivation and inequalities. And this is something that started very much within the Inclusive Growth Initiative that the organization launched in 2012. At a time where we, I mean, as an organization, we're essentially documenting a large rise of inequalities in a lot of our members. And we were also coming with strong evidence suggesting that inequalities are not just, you know, a moral imperative or a social imperative. They actually are also a very, very strong, large economic imperative. And so, in fact, we produced work that showed that the increase of income inequalities that was seen in many of our economies over the last 30 years, they had very negative effects in terms of, you know, limiting and framing the opportunities of the next generations. For instance, we produced a study that is called the broken social elevator, that suggests that it would take a child born into a poor family 4 to 5 generations, meaning under 50 years, to actually reach the average income. And this is just the average for OECD, but, you know, we have member countries where actually this number is much larger than that. In a recent work that we have done and launched last year, and I actually wanted to mention the name of the person that was instrumental to this work, Grania Dirvan, who should be in the room with us. I don't see her, but you're so many that I can't see all of you. But anyway, Grania should be with us, and she was really the mastermind behind that piece of work. And that was a very interesting exercise that was looking at the issues of vulnerability. So we developed, in fact, a new approach for understanding the vulnerability of children. And trying to understand not just who are the most vulnerable children in OECD, but what are the factors of vulnerabilities, what are all the different interrelationships that we see there, and the whole idea of understanding vulnerability is really to understand how the different sort of factors sort of interplay and play with each other, and how some of those factors just compound naturally the disadvantage of some of the children. But also then, what it means for policies to become kind of a mediating force to counteract those compounded disadvantages and inequalities. So there again, we go to this idea that, and that is what we're trying to do today, is actually to develop sort of transversal child well-being strategies for governments, because we want to make sure that, again, this is not an area and that is work on in the Ministry of Welfare. Most, in fact, of the times, I would say, if I just have to judge from the current, situation in the OECD countries, child well-being is still, I would say, the area of expertise and before also, the area where the most of the policy action is taken, but it's just in the social sphere, and we actually are saying this is something that should be really mainstream, that brought up, across boundaries. So. We try now to put in place really a system where we can make sure that the countries can monitor the progress they are making on those on child well-being outcomes. But that starts obviously by, identifying the right data for doing so, not just in terms of what should be the main child well-being outcomes that they have to look into, and importantly, looking at different stages in life, because of course we also know that vulnerabilities of children is a notion that changes, over the lifetime of people, and so it is really important to have a sort of a longitudinal follow-up of that. But also, and even more importantly, I would say, we are working with the countries to put in place a monitoring system that is especially attentive, I would say, to the policy effort and inputs on those outcomes. So in conclusion, I would like to give you perhaps a sense of where we are heading now. Jennifer just mentioned to you that we created the WISE Center, the Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity. I would say the mission is probably very, very aligned with the one of the Center for Sustainable Development. And really one of the main priority and main mission for us is really to take forward the well-being and inclusive growth agendas that the OECD has developed over the last 20 years. But within WISE, I'm pleased to say that we created a special team. So, we have, it's not a big center that we are 30 people, but we have one team that is focusing on child well-being. So I think that speaks very much to the fact that child well-being is going to be one of our priorities, in fact, for the next couple of years at the very least. And we are collaborating with a number of colleagues across the house and in the OECD to make sure, again, that we are bringing together different pieces of data and different perspectives there. So we're going to have, as I mentioned already, a more in-depth discussion tomorrow with the countries, and through that we will collect also more evidence on what countries have been doing in the context of COVID-19, so what have been sort of the immediate policy response, but also, we want to engage again early on this debate on how they see this, evolving at a time where there will be sort of definitely pressurized, and so there will be a lot of tensions in terms of spending. And so perhaps one element that I can elaborate now briefly, but that suggests to be the strategy there, is the idea that we would like to develop sort of an evaluation framework to help countries prioritize spending in areas where actually programs can have proven returns, meaning high social returns. So again, it's not just a general framework, it's really a framework for evaluating child well-being and family well-being policies, but to understand, what are the benefits and what are the returns that are coming up from those programs. And the idea why we're doing this is because we want to come up with, very, very good indications to governments, now as they are still, some of them, in fact, working on defining their recovery packages. Europe is, fully into that. They just, as you may know, launch a very huge facility that is called the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So several millions of euros is going to be spent, and in fact all European countries are now working on defining and designing those plans. So within that, we are going to assist Europe And so through one with one of our tools, and in particular the ones I just mentioned, this evaluation framework, but also, it's not going to be for the for the recovery resilience. We also know that there will be a time where countries are going to start spending reviews, because they will have to look into the issues of consolidating fiscal budgets and positions. And therefore, in that context, having a tool that tells them, to what extent some spending are, more impactful from the perspective of generating child well-being and higher well-being for all, because this is really this perspective of social returns, right? So that you are not just improving the position of children. This is, I would say, of course, is of primary importance, but the whole proposition here is actually to say that when you invest in child well-being, you're actually, just getting a lot of, returns from a broader well-being perspective now and in the future. So I think that I'm actually done with all I wanted to share with you, and right now, and I'm looking forward to questions and to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Romina, and so much to think about in what you've shared. I think I'm quite struck by Anne's bringing in really helpful thinking about checks and balances in relation to the use of international law and national strategic litigation. And in contrast, you're bringing in something quite again, a very different angle of thinking about the use of data and the importance of having tools and frameworks that help to steer member states to make decisions that are then going to realize, ultimately, I think, the same SDGs and rights that Anne is talking about from a different perspective. So it's a really lovely complementary input, and I think there's lots to explore together on this. And I'm really excited to be working with you and Professor Andrew Gowdy in the work that the OECD is beginning to take forward in this new center that you have, building on all of the good work in the last 10 years. So thank you for that really stimulating input. And we're going to move to hear from our final speaker, and then we'll have a chance to discuss between Romina, Anne, and Manaf, our three speakers, any thoughts or ideas that they have between themselves about what's been said, and then we'll open it up for more questions. So now let me introduce you to our last but by no means least speaker. This is Mr. Abdul Manaf Kimokai. He is the director of DCI in Sierra Leone, and in fact, actually, he was one of the founding members that founded DCI in Sierra Leone. DCI is Defense for Children International, and it has a long, really important history in helping NGOs and the wider community of civil society understand how children's rights are being realized, and in fact, even how the Convention on the Rights of the Child was developed in those early days. So Manaf is also not only the director in Sierra Leone, but also the president of the International Executive Council of Defense for Children International. He extended in Sierra Leone the organization's operation from the capital city of Freetown into 3 provinces in Sierra Leone, where the organization was much more needed for its advocacy campaigns related to child abuse in particular. Manaf has also been involved in the development of the national standard for the protection of children in the criminal justice system in Sierra Leone, and part of the technical team that developed the national juvenile justice strategy. He leads a program of work that's so impressive called the Socio-Legal Defense Centers that provide social and legal assistance to children to ensure they're given adequate protection and access to justice. And for that, he received the prestigious Child 10 Award in recognition of his support as a leader of a grassroots organization that really brings some innovative solutions to address the urgent and really pressing issues for children. I've had the great privilege of speaking with Manaf since the COVID crisis began in order to better understand what we could learn from the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone that would then give us much greater insights into how we around the world could be responding to COVID, and his insights into the unintended consequences about that policy can have, and the importance of really thinking very carefully about how we're always first and foremost thinking about the impact on children and the needs and rights of children is always so striking. So with that introduction, I'm hoping against all hope that Manaf's Wi-Fi signal is strong enough for us to hear him clearly. And Manaf, over to you. We're really pleased to be hearing from you today.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and I hope my voice is loud and clear.
We can hear you, Manaf. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And basically, I would like to talk more on the broader perspective of children's life situation, especially in a country like Sierra Leone, where there's so much to do for children. And then it's also important to look at how the COVID crisis has exacerbated the activities of children and what are the specific issues that children and families are grappling with, and the impact on access to justice for children. And then lastly, I will talk about our role as Friends for Children International, especially using the Social Legal Defense Center initiative to ensure that children, both those in conflict with the law as well as those who are victims, have access to justice. To start with, I would like to commend last speakers for actually elaborating so much on vulnerabilities of children. I had Professor Hans Kelton really citing the General Comment on 19, who sets a kind of caveats that in a situation like COVID-19, government and states should ensure that children are affected or that their situation does not get worse. Unfortunately, this is the reverse in our context because pandemics have become really political in this part of the world. Making reference to Ebola, Ebola came a few years ago when we had different governments, and a lot of things happened, including corruption and also mismanagement of the whole crisis. And during the last election campaign in 2018, there was so much being said against past government, and unfortunately for them, the last election, we had a new government. And with the new government, COVID-19 came. So the new government put themselves under so much pressure. Not even looking much into the past lessons learned. They just tried to come in robustly, but really focusing more on politics and security, thinking that security and regimental interventions force will actually be the best strategy to contain the virus at the expense of human rights standards and so on. So government certainly imposed state of emergency, and there were a lot of restrictions, forgetting the fact that these restrictions are also coming at a time when vulnerability of children and families in particular are likely to increase. Now, in terms of the real life situation of children in Sierra Leone, Sierra Leone is a country where traditionally families, because we have a lot of poor families here, actually depend on children to provide for food. Fortunately, children are the ones that provide water because most families do not have access to running pipeline water. So they fetch water from water wells and other sources outside the home. So the adults are not normally the ones who go out to fetch water for these children. And also when there is economic crisis, of course there's always, but in situations like this, you notice that becomes exacerbated and families become poorer. So the pressure is more on children. They are the ones who will be subjected to street trading, also child labor, including like breaking stones, and a lot of famine, and a lot of other things that families would depend on to ensure that the home survives. And unfortunately, this happens also when schools are closed. So there is even greater tendency for families to engage children more in child labor. And so
And
yeah,
I'm just going to cut in for a moment to say you're beginning to cut in and out quite a bit, just laterally. I wonder if I can ask you to stay with this one point and finish it up. I'm going to see if I can try and reiterate those key points that you've been making. Why don't you finish up your statement and then we can come back.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, but it seems to cut out quite a bit.
Okay, is it okay now? Anyway, let me move on to points I'm making. So all of these shifts I'm talking about affect children. But what is really, really critical, especially for the topic that we are discussing here today, which is really with 16 of the SDG, access to justice for children. It is about the relationship between access to justice and also the restrictions, the new rules that come along with the state of emergency because of the pandemic. During this period, we have had a lot of lockdowns, but I just want to give some examples of how some of these lockdowns affected children and how it was also connected to access to justice. As I said in the intro, children are those that provide water to homes because these homes don't have access to running water. Now, during the lockdowns, government does not provide running water for children. And they have imposed curfew that no one is supposed to be outside his or her compound to do anything outside the home. So during lockdowns, we had a lot of children going out to fetch water. And the police came in, they were arresting these children and young people. And it really became a big problem. They were arresting them, taking them to the station, but also taking away their containers that they have been using to fetch water. So the aspect of vulnerability was there, but also now trampling on the rights of children, especially also bringing them into the justice system. At the time when even the courts that are supposed to ensure that if someone is arrested for a crime, their cases should be heard within the shortest possible time. The courts were not operating because government shut down courts and a lot of other. So how are you going to bring a lot of children and young people to the justice system, especially at the police level, for things that are not supposed to be arrested for, because as government is not provided, but at the same time have criminalized what they are doing simply because of what they have imposed on their state of emergency. So this is one way by which children, we are unlawfully, children and young people, for example, we are unlawfully arrested and brought into the justice system simply because they were accused of going or violating state of emergency rules that were set to guide lockdowns without looking into the reasons why these children were actually going out in the streets to fetch water or to do what we were doing. And so...
Enough, I'm just going to jump in. So I think I'm hearing part of what you're saying, but not all of it. And I want to just see if I've got the story right. So you're giving us a really compelling example of the ways in which, first you were starting out with talking about the ways in which pandemics can be quite politicized, and then the ways in which the decisions around how to manage the pandemic compromises children's rights and their well-being. And the example you were giving us was where people were not allowed to go out even to get water, but people did go out to get water because they needed water. And those people, including young people who were doing this, were arrested. And then through that, were then engaged, pulled into the justice system really unnecessarily. Does that feel, have I captured that accurately?
exactly what I was trying to talk about, just linking the crises and the realities of children to justice, especially looking at the effect on children. So that was just an example. Then also, if you look at the entire response management framework,
And
yes.
I'm so sorry, but I think the connection is really difficult. We're getting some messages saying that it's really hard to it's getting really hard to hear. And I wonder, actually, is it possible? Have you got a camera on at the moment? No, you don't have anything on.
Okay, I've changed position. Is it okay if I change position?
Let's give this one more go. I think, actually, Manav, could I suggest I'm going to suggest one thing. I want to come in with another story that you shared with me before as another example in which children's rights were being breached in the context of the response to pandemic in Ebola. And then I wonder if we could come in for a couple of comments and questions from others, just to try and give us a bit of space and see if we can hear you better in a few moments. So when Manaf was speaking previously with me, he was sharing about the way in which there were young women who were pregnant. There's a much greater increase in pregnancy rates in Sierra Leone during and after Ebola. And the schools, however, had rules that banned girls from going to school when they were pregnant. So they had no way to access their right to education through that process. And given the significance in terms of the numbers of girls who become pregnant, it became a real challenge in terms of numbers of girls who were just not having any access to their education. And so following Ebola, in advance of this pandemic, there was a significant lobby of the NGO sector to ensure that these girls would be able to get education, even despite the various reasons why they hadn't felt that girls who were pregnant should be allowed to have access to school. And so I think there was a really powerful example of the ways in which there may have been a legitimate reason why they were trying to steer the girls who were pregnant away from school from that perspective. But they weren't providing another alternative education to those girls. And that response from the NGO sector was a really significant way of being able to ensure these girls had access to being able to get their rights to education met. I would like to come back in here with a question, actually, with Anne and Romina and Manaf, if I may. And Manaf, we'll hear if we can get a bit more access to your sound in a little bit. So Anne, let's pull this around to a bigger question between the three speakers, if I may. Anne's reflections on the general comment 19 I thought were hugely important, especially as we see the huge economic and financial pressures that are now hitting government budgets across the world. I wonder, would you each, Anne and Romina and Manaf, perhaps say a little of how you feel we could do more to protect and to advance the policies and the programs to support children in both the highest and the lowest countries at this time? For example, can we better demonstrate how a child well-being vision that we might all hold and that is driven by the SDGs is also a major contributor to the other key broader objectives of governments around the world? For example, in the OECD focus on inclusive growth, certainly on the views of children's well-being being actually a really key indicator of the future stability of a society and prosperity of the economy. So from an economic perspective, there's an argument there that perhaps could be more strongly won. And from a rights perspective, is that something that Anne and Manaf, you would see as being something useful? Tell me what your reflections might be on what we can do differently and better in this context.
Shall I go first? Yes, I think, you know, looking at it from the committee's perspective, I mean, we always do look at, you know, government's planning and budgeting, but I think that we're going to have to be extra vigilant, because we know that states might, well, we know they are already talking about economic recovery plans and restructured budgets, and in that can get there's a great risk that investment in early childhood development, for example, might be placed on hold, or you know, support for families might be lessened, or school feeding might be cut back on, and so we actually have to be very sure that states are doing their economic recovery in a way that is preventive and supportive of families raising children. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not able to really make a strong economic argument, but I can tell you that at the committee we do have people with expertise in those areas, and we are guided by General Comment 19 in making those assessments. But the other thing is that we obviously always have access to what the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights are asking states parties as well. So we can and we do, but we need to even more take note of, you know, what the discourse is that's going on around children's socioeconomic rights, because I think this is where we are going to see the big impact on SDGs.
Thank you very much. Oh, Manaf or Romina? Manaf, can we try having you come in? Is there a response you have here?
Yes, I want to call me, and I hope my connection is now better. How are you getting it?
I'm hearing you clearly enough, loudly enough now, but I think it breaks up quite quickly. So maybe just be very brief if you can.
Okay, I'll be brief. Like, from experience, what we really need here in this part of the world is to ensure that even the government delivery, service delivery system is really better organized to ensure that even when there is support from outside or even resources from within, these resources in terms of delivery can be well coordinated to actually reach the right people. I'll give an example. We have been talking about support for vulnerable groups, especially when you talk about cash transfer programs, social protection programs. And government had established an institution called the National Commission for Social Action, and charged with the responsibility of really providing resources for vulnerable people. And in a meeting some time ago, we are talking about victims of trafficking, COVID-19, and a host of children. And somebody from this institution said, we have a lot of money to provide cash support and other services to children and other vulnerable people, but we don't have the statistics. So can the Ministry of Social Welfare provide us with statistics? And we didn't have. So access to data and how that data is organized together with keeping coordination among government institutions and also rearrangement of how the structures can ensure that delivery of services is really done accordingly and smoothly is sometimes even more important than bringing resources from outside. Because many times the resources are actually here, but because of the way our systems are organized. Then the other thing I would like to really talk about is the aspect of what kind of...
1 second to rephrase.
Yes.
Manaf, can I just come in just to make sure I'm going to reiterate what you said so people can be sure to have heard, and you can tell me if I've got this right. The point you're making was the importance of being able to ensure that we are supporting the delivery of services, and that there is a capability to be able, that quite often there will be capability to deliver, and rather than having something from the outside coming in to add to that, to actually support those who are in the community who are able to deliver services. Did I get that
exactly.
right?
Yeah, but that is really more connected to data. You have the right data, you know where people are, because like I said, sometimes there are resources, but the government doesn't even have data on the people who actually need these resources. And the second thing I want to dilate on is really about how do we enable children to claim their own rights before government coming to seize their right. I would just relate it to the example I gave relating to access to water for children and families. I think it would have been better for children and families or citizens to claim this right, really start asking to be proactive, start asking government for these rights rather than even waiting until they are arrested, simply because they want to go out and get something that is part of their fundamental rights. So the aspect of citizens, especially children, what mechanisms should be in place for them to be proactive, to really start asking questions, start holding government accountable and putting government under pressure to address these issues. Like you rightly gave example of pregnant girls. If we hadn't put pressure on the government and not on the right law, these girls would have continued still out of school. So these are some of the good practices I think we can also incorporate into our next plans.
Thank you, Manaf, very much. I think it's really valuable to be hearing that point being made about the importance of children claiming their message today for us, and I'm glad you've brought that in. Thank you. And I'm sorry that the connection is poor. And now my system is saying my system is unstable, so you'll have to let me know if I'm now starting to be difficult to hear. I'd like to bring the questions back around to Romina now. In terms of there are some questions that we've been asked, but I'd like to just hold on first to that question that I'd asked that Anne has responded to, which is really just any thoughts you have about what we can do to, and that Manaf responded to, what we can do to protect and advance the policies and programs to support children in highest and lowest countries at this time.
I think this is really about building the case, you know, for those policies, and we've been thinking about a framework for that with Andrea Goody, which is first of all clarifying, you know, the objectives of those policies around, I would say, two types of actions. The idea that the programs need to have as a goal the fact that we want to sort of stem the flow of children and young people into risky situations or in adversity. So we want to really so kind of, you know, slow down that flow and sort of reduce the numbers of those that become vulnerable. But also, we also want to take remedial action and making sure that we are correct and fix as much as possible the needs and the rights of those that are already experiencing sort of adversity. The important about, so how do we do that? I think it's as usual, the devil sort of lies in the details, because this will be very interesting to hear, but you know, what is that we mean by that? I think that is what we want to do at the OECD now in the next couple of years, to essentially run studies that quantify the benefits, the economic benefits that come from essentially designing and implementing child well-being programs that essentially want to do, first of all, want to sort of maximize, let's say, the short-term benefits of child well-being. So what we mean by that is the fact that we want to make sure that those programs, and there was a question in the chat about somebody that say, but you know, how we can make sure that the programs in fact are not only designed and, you know, for reaching out to the ones that need it the most, but in a way those programs really capture, you know, the reality of specific populations as opposed to all children, which is, you know, one of the issues stake here, maybe one of the issues why, I mean, sometimes it's hard to get, I think, to push the needs of vulnerable children, because we know that, you know, somebody will say, oh, but you know, what about the children are not vulnerable? But anyway, we do to put a lot of emphasis in particular on the programs that can bring better mental health of vulnerable children and child development, but also programs that can in fact increase the capacity of the vulnerable children to benefit from education. And it's important to think not just of in any case, you know, when you're designing policies and programs for children, you never really, they need to be kind of child-centered, but on the other hand, you have to take into account obviously the fact that you know, that those programs are not sort of implemented in a vacuum, and essentially, you know, the family conditions and all the family environment matters a lot, you know, for the good receptions of those policies. But I think the point is to say, you know, we need specific programs that are for the vulnerable children, families, and for instance, are also or are able to connect to the abilities of parents, for instance, you know, to put in place responsible caregiving, or for instance, to reduce their financial stress. So we know this is one of, I mean, the stress is something that is transmitted on and passed on very easily to children. But that is what I would say relates really to the issue of short-term benefits for children. But we also know that why those programs are interesting is because, you know, they can bring about broader society benefits, or benefits for the society at large. So typically, you know, if you are doing the right investments there, then you can actually undergo budgetary savings because you don't necessarily have to continue spending on the vulnerable children. You know, once you have taken strong actions and you see, of course, that this action is you know, bringing inputs, then at some point you can also imagine that you can reduce your spending there. And of course, the important thing is when you're trying to build the case, and so when you're trying today to think about what are the items that need to be prioritized and what are the items where governments can't cut spending, is also take into account the longer term perspectives. And so there we already have ample evidence that says that essentially if you're investing in the well-being of the poorest and more vulnerable children today, this pays off to the society tomorrow, because it means, you know, increased skills, it means broader employment and well-being opportunities, and etc. I mean, I could go on for you know, with many other examples. The problem is that we have, maybe the way we see at the OECD is that we have done that work in a little bit of a patchy way, and not really crystallize it, not really package it in a way that you know, again, builds the case for children. So, you know, we see it as, you know, how we should invest, but not necessarily in the priorities of children. So to say that now we start having a clear conceptual framework, but we still need to sort of put the data together and make sure again that these are also, I would say, pieces of evidence that can be recognized by our countries.
Thank you very much, Romina. Can I turn to Anne for a moment and ask you a question that's come through? So great to have so many questions from the attendees. Actually, this is a straightforward question, I think, which is about how the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child interacts with regional bodies, in particular the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Could you give us just a bit of a context in how that works? And then I have a question for Manaf after that.
Well, there aren't any formal interactions, in the sense that certainly in the years that I've been on the committee, that we haven't ever had any joint sessions or interaction in a formal way. Of course, as it happens, 2 of our current members are also members of the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. So there's a kind of informal interaction, I would say, through that mechanism. And certainly I think many members of both committees are, you know, keep on top of what's coming out of the other committees, particularly in terms of jurisprudence, because obviously with OPIC, we're actually somewhat behind the regional mechanisms. You know, the the communications procedure under the Convention on the Rights of the Child only came into operation in 2014, and so therefore some of the other committees, like the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, is in a sense further down the line in terms of the development of jurisprudence. And so our committee certainly watches the jurisprudence coming out of the other treaty bodies very carefully.
Thank you. Can I ask Manaf another question that's coming through? Some of these aren't entirely connected, but I think it speaks to the wider agenda for our seminar today. Manaf, there's a question that's come in that's about thinking through the right to privacy at the same time as thinking about the right to provision or access to services. And I wonder if you could speak to how, I'm not sure if we heard you correctly, but as you were speaking about some of the ways in which access to justice is being served, how are we ensuring that we're protecting the privacy of the young people while that help is being provided? Are there risks to that? Is there anything that you can advise us on?
Yes, there is a lot of risk, and also privacy of young people who have been victims of violence and also probably in conflict with law have been very much compromised owing to the fact that there's a lot of social media campaigns. And even within the civil society, sometimes you wonder whether people really have enough trainings, enough understanding about children's rights, and also whether they can preserve these rights. Because some of them, because of the zest to just communicate, to show that, oh, we are dealing with these issues, we are monitoring a case like this. We go on social media exposing the identities of children who are victims that they are already working with. So more or less, they become more interested in talking about their own work at the expense of the victims that they are providing services for. So a lot of children have been put on risk because of this. Their identities have been compromised. And many times the approach is like more humanitarian than human rights. So instead of really ensuring that all those human rights principles that guide access to justice or provision of services to children are adhered to, it becomes more of support to vulnerable groups and people trying, or organizations, including even government, trying to make political gains or whatever gains they want at the expense of these children. So it is happening a lot. And as a civil society campaigner, Friends for Children International, I think it is really important that new policies coming in to protect children from violence and also provide services to children do not really compromise confidentiality. No matter what kind of support you want to give children, that support should not be greater than their own human rights. And these things should be well presented in policies, and also ensure that government, the justice system, but also children have the right to challenge these rights, even when government is compromising. So I think it is a reality, and it is important that we consider this aspect strongly, especially in policy reviews.
I think, Manaf, that's a fantastic reminder for us about the importance of rights and a rights approach beyond simply trying to achieve children's needs being realized, and the difference in that in terms of making sure that children's privacy rights are also respected when we're meeting their needs. Thanks, that's a great note to end on. I think as we see the closing of the time with just one last minute to go, let me say that for those of you who are interested in the recording of this, it will be available on the Center for Sustainable Development website in due course, and you'll be notified by email when that's been made available. I want to just really thank you all for your interest in both Inspiring Children's Futures for Sustainable Development. And but most of all, I would like to thank, I'm going to start with Manaf and say, Manaf, many people in the questions and answers have echoed this sentiment that actually the very fact that you are having difficulty and we're having difficulty hearing you and not seeing you is a good example of the inequalities between people from different countries around the world. And we're really sorry that we didn't get a chance to see you and that we didn't hear you more clearly. And we look forward to future times when we're engaging with you and hopefully in better circumstances. Can I say thank you to our speakers, Professor Anne Skelton, Dr. Romina Borini, and Mr. Manaf Kimukai, for a fantastically varied and really rich sort of beginning to explore the different routes in which the many different mechanisms that are needed to really, for us to ensure that we can realize children's rights and meet their needs effectively so that they can really achieve all the opportunities that they ought to be achieving. So can I say thank you again to everyone, and I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.